Welcome to the Life Stuff 101 podcast, dedicated to sharing stories and insights to inspire you to always make your mental and emotional wellness a top priority. We talk to people who share their personal journeys and experiences, as well as to people who share their professional expertise. And there'll also be other times when we share personal tips and stories, which will hopefully somehow spark that aha moment for you too. Because we all have those moments when we think, I wish I had known that earlier in life. That's what Life Stuff 101 is all about. Our discussion today is for general information purposes and not meant to be specific advice. For personalized support and specific answers to questions you may have, please consult the appropriate medical or mental health care professional. Now here's your host who's on this wild adventure ride of life just like you, and yes, a real life person who's actually slipped on a banana peel along the way. Mental wellness coach and psychotherapist Mio Yokoi.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Life Stuff 101. My name is Mio Yokoi. I work as a registered psychotherapist in Toronto, Canada, and also as a coach and supporter to striving, highly sensitive folks everywhere. First of all, I hope you're doing well and in good health. So it might be a little confusing with all these extra episodes I've been uploading the last couple of weeks, but let me just talk about that really quickly before we get into today's episode. During this time of the COVID-19 crisis, this is currently April of 2020, I started to upload mini episodes called the Challenging Times Self-Care Challenge to offer prompts to hopefully provide some self-care support. Initially, I had a very optimistic idea that I'd be uploading daily episodes, but it soon became clear to me that it wouldn't be sustainable. So I've scaled back the self-care challenge episodes to 3 times a week. So they'll be uploaded on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. The self-care challenge episodes are roughly 10 minutes in length, and you can get access to each of the episodes at lifestuff101.com/challenge. This episode that you're listening to right now is a full-length, I guess what I call a regular episode. And in these full-length episodes that will be released on Tuesdays, I will feature an interview with someone who has expertise or experience or insights, or they are open to talking about their experiences, their own personal experiences when it comes to mental health, mindset, and personal development. And at other times, it might just be a solo episode just featuring me, maybe going into a deeper dive when it comes to certain topics or areas of interest. But today, I'm very pleased to welcome back Nina K. Moore. Nina is an anxiety coach based here in Toronto, Canada, like I am. And Nina and I met late last year when I came across information that she was locally running a workshop related to planning for holiday-related anxiety. I invited her to chat about holiday-related anxiety for the podcast. And it's worth listening to because it's not just specific to anxiety around the holidays. Please take a listen to episode 18. Just as an aside, this episode was recorded a few months ago, way before the situation with COVID-19, but I think that anxiety is running higher than ever with all the rapid changes that have been occurring, and hopefully my conversation with Nina might shed some light around understanding and managing anxiety. Please enjoy my conversation with Nina K. Moore. So, Nina K. Moore is back with me today, and I'm so glad to be talking to her. And just before we actually started, we were talking about the K in Nina K. Moore, and just not going to talk too much about it, I don't think. But I was trying to maybe poke a little bit to try to figure out what that is. But there's a little bit of intrigue there, I think. But she joined me previously for an episode, which is episode 18, where we spoke specifically about holiday-related anxiety and how to put an action plan in place to help anxiety that can be experienced during that time of year. So please go and check it out. I think that not only was it really meaningful from the standpoint of talking about managing and planning for holiday-related anxiety, but also just talking about anxiety that can come up based on different circumstances that are going on and how it's possible to talk about it or to share it or to process it. And I felt like it was a really great chat that you and I had. And so I'm glad to really reconnect with you today.
Yeah, me too. And I was thinking about that episode because we were talking about like the winter holidays, but that's almost irrelevant. Like it really applies to any cyclical anxiety. Like, it's coming, like whether it be like back to school or the time of year when your aunt visits that triggers you or whatever. It's like preparing for the inevitable anxiety. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. It's true. Sometimes I think grounding it in a specific event allows for people to go, to relate to it. Because it's true to have, perhaps this is something that we can talk about too today. Maybe we'll get to it. But this idea of just having a plan just in general in life, but then to be able to manage anxiety if that's something that is a specific struggle for folks. But to be able to also ground it in specific situations that would be relevant to that individual, it is, I think, a really important thing to think about and to plan for. But I think today we're going to widen the net and talk more about anxiety in a larger context. And because so many of us do have experiences and relationships with anxiety, and I like that, Nina, I think that you talk about it from that standpoint, that there is a relationship with anxiety, right? That it's not that we necessarily say like, I am anxiety, or to over identify with a part of us, but that to think about it as a relationship. And when we do so, that there is a different way in which we can relate to it. I think it's such an important thing. And I'm so glad that we're having an opportunity to have this discussion. So thanks so much for joining me again.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
And, even though anxiety isn't necessarily the most fun topic of things to talk about, I think it's also important to know that as individuals, we're multifaceted and that we have all kinds of different experiences. And on that note, I wonder if there's a fun fact that you can share with us today, Nina.
Oh, yeah. I was thinking about this, and it was well into my adulthood when I discovered that a pony is not a baby horse.
It's not?
It's not. Did you seriously not know that?
No.
Oh, that's awesome.
I am way into my chronologically speaking, into my adulthood. But I thought that that's what ponies were.
No, a pony is a totally separate breed. And I remember I was in a car full of people. This is so interesting because nobody knows everything, right? Just the fact that you don't know that is great. I was in a car full of people.
Oh my God, I don't know much of anything. But
welcome to the club. And I just got like the funniest looks. I just remember like the conversation stopped and it was like, Nina. So that's awesome that you don't know that.
No.
So we have the same fun fact.
I'm coming at this very much later. So would you happen to know what would be what a baby horse would be called?
Is it a foal or a calf is a cow?
And that's interesting too, in that there are some species, I guess, that have names for their babies. And then some things are just baby whatevers. Like, I don't think koala bears, for instance,
right,
have like a name for, a specific, name for what a baby koala would be.
Baby horse is called, is it pronounced a foal? Foal? I've just looked it up.
Yeah. I have trouble pronouncing that word too, because fowl would be like a bird. Foal?
FOAL. So what's a baby? Wow. See, and I have a passion for farm animals, right? So that's the wonderful thing, right? Nobody knows everything.
That's awesome. So, okay, that was a great learn. Thanks so much for that.
That's right.
Let's switch gears.
That's so great though, because I spent a lot of time thinking that was a big deal not to know, right?
Yeah.
Because I'm always the person that doesn't know the song that everybody knows, or I feel like I'm always that person, but I think we're all always we're all that person because we can't know everything.
At some point.
Right?
At some time.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and that most of us walk around, I think, thinking that everybody else has it figured out or they all know all the stuff. And we're all looking at each other like, you and I, like if we were to have walk by each other on the street, we might look at each other independently and be like, oh, she's got it all figured out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
When I know for myself, I look around me and I'm like, well, why does everybody seem so kind of together?
Yeah.
Why does everybody seem to have it all sorted out, it looks like?
It looks like she's even brushed her hair today.
I think that's part of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think it's part of the human condition that we all know what we know, but also that there's a whole bunch of stuff that we don't. But generally speaking, we're pretty messy.
Oh, my shoulders just relaxed.
Yeah. But on that note,
okay.
Yeah. So we'll get back to the topic that you and I have been talking about. But again, like in a more kind of a larger kind of context, in your experience and the way that you think about it, how would you describe anxiety?
I describe it as both mental and physical, as ever evolving, like us, on a continuum. And I would say that anxiety is a trickster. It's very confusing. And that how it manifests itself in each of us is such a reflection, such a mirror to the fact that we are all so fiercely unique. I don't know. Does that make it a gift in a way? Like some of us implode, some of us explode, some of us do both. So the explode, I certainly experience others and sometimes myself desperate to control their anxiety. And because they're not at a place where they can yet, then their presence becomes very overbearing and over-involved. I implode. Externally, I probably look shut down, or sometimes my biggest fear, indifferent. So maybe if I just talk a little bit about what it is for me: foggy brain, racing thoughts, inability to retain information, which leads to more panic and more spinning, because what did my colleague just ask me to do, right? I mix up my words. So I forget the names of people and things. Like I lose my nouns when I'm trying to talk. And it's interesting because I do a workshop, or I even talk to somebody, or inevitably what comes up is my asking or them automatically volunteering what are the signs and symptoms for them. And so I've started to record all that information, and I have it right in front of me. I have every page has its own letter of the alphabet, and I've just started organizing all the signs and symptoms by alphabetically. So if you want to give me any letter of the alphabet, Mio, I'll read you off some signs and symptoms that I've collected from people.
Okay. How about R?
R. Okay. Let's see what's under R. Racing mind, restless.
That's great, by the way, that you've done that.
Yeah. Relationships suffer. Remorse for behaviors and mischances. So for S, I have shoulder pain, stigmatized, social anxiety, sensory overload, speech, too fast, too slow, long pauses, stumbling on speech, sweats, sluggish, shivers, suffering, sad, stomach pains and cramps, spinning thoughts, short fuse, stress, secretive, suicidal, suicide ideation, self-harm, self-medicate, sense of doom. So I don't have an empty letter.
It literally spans the alphabet.
Yeah. And every time I hear something new.
In your experience, when you've talked about what you notice for yourself, maybe the word recall or stumbling over words, maybe mixing up words and so forth, or like freezing. Do you think that is when you notice that you're experiencing anxiety, or are there other signs ahead of that you've noticed?
Yeah. So there are other signs ahead. Great question.
Mm-hmm.
Fatigue, moodiness, feeling overwhelmed with day-to-day things. Like I might be cooking and my daughter's talking to me and I'm overwhelmed by having to manage both. And my space getting very cluttered. So the counters are full. And this can happen while I'm going through like a really intense, like creative period too, but it feels different, right? So my physical space, I get overwhelmed in my physical space very quickly.
And and those are signs that you notice. It's like, oh, like I am noticing, I'm looking around and my physical space is not the way in which I otherwise would like it.
Yeah. And I haven't been to yoga in 3 days. And for me, that's like part of my like non-negotiable, but all of a sudden there's just been really valid reasons not to go, and realizing that now I don't know what any of those reasons were. So it's such a good question, because that's like, for me now, prevention like is it's like to catch it at that stage when like I use kind of like the analogy of the door being shut or open ajar. Like when I can catch it that, oh, the door's closing, but I can still grab that door and open it back up. That's a lot less work than having to start from scratch. So that is an enormous part of my health regimen is like that prevention piece and catching it as soon as possible.
Is breath for you something that you notice as well? Like how you might be using your breath or not using your breath?
Yeah. So for me, I feel like I need to add a disclaimer when I say this, because and even like when I say yoga out loud, I feel like I have to qualify it with, I know that's not the cure for everything, because I feel like this day and age, like I remember saying to my naturopath, like if one more person tells me to breathe, I'm going to lose it. Right. So it's like, but it's not the fix all when we're in it and we're in crisis, but breathing for me is major in prevention and in coming back to myself. So that's why for me, Kundalini yoga has been so big, because it's based on awareness and breath work. And breathing, like even just coming back to the sensation that when you see a baby breathe innately, when they inhale, their belly expands. And when they exhale, their belly goes down. And with life and stress, we lose that innate motion. And so coming back to that is big for me.
I mentioned breath because there's a number of things that I am really focused on. And a lot of the times people are looking for, okay, like, give me something, right? That's gonna help. Give me something that's going to be the thing or the quote unquote cure or whatever it is. And I'm glad that you gave that disclaimer, because I think, as we had talked about in the last episode too, it's not about the cure, or it's not about saying like, I'm going to overcome this thing. It's more about realizing, oh, this is a part of who I am, and it's going to maybe change and flex, and it's going to be a part of me in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
It's just, how is it that I live with it, or how do I have a relationship with it? I really like that, right? This idea of like, how do I have a relationship with it? Just like we have relationships with pretty much everything in our lives. The thing about the breath, though, which is really fascinating, is that we all take for granted the fact that we breathe, or we need to breathe, right, in order to live. I mean, that's part of just being able to have life, is that we need to oxygenate. Yes, we need oxygen in order to do that. The thing, though, is that we take it so for granted that we don't understand how important or how crucial the breath can be. And it's something that I talk about in my work quite a bit. And just like you, I used to also feel like, just being told breathe is just like, yeah, I know, like that's the deep breathing thing is the thing that I'm supposed to be doing. I know, like it's everywhere, right? But the thing I think that gets missed in it often is the discussion around the importance of why. And the why we actually have the different mechanisms of the shallow breath versus the deeper belly breath.
There you go. Yeah.
Yeah. And when we understand it, then it makes sense, And so the shallow breath is so that it allows us to access breath as quickly as possible, therefore energy as quick as possible, right? So the idea is that if we're stressed, or if our stress is activated, or anxiety, which is like in a lot of ways like prolonged chronic stress is activated, we're constantly feeling like we're in danger. And when physiologically, when we're in danger, the idea is that we run, right? And in order to run, we need to get our breath as quickly as possible. We don't have time to get our breath from our belly when we would be relaxed, kind of chilling, And so when we're able to switch the breath from the shallow breath to the belly breath, it tells then the brain and the central nervous system that it's okay, like there isn't danger here. And that is, it's one thing to talk about the mechanism behind, okay, like, we need to be able to breathe deeper and have belly breaths. But what we're actually doing is signaling to our brain that there's no real danger in this moment that we have to run from.
That's it, right? That's exactly it. And that's because I'm very aware of kind of in this, like in our context today, you'll notice that like I don't use words like, I don't talk a lot about meditation or mindfulness or breathing, even though those are all things that I regularly practice. Because like for me, when I heard that when I was in crisis, like my ears just closed because it was always presented not in the context that you've just shared, but in the context that add breathing, add mindfulness to your life, and it will ease your anxiety. And there was no dialogue of why am I in this state to start with, right? So like kind of thinking about, breathing activities that are brought into the classroom, but we're not changing the circumstances that call for our attention to come back to our breath. So, and that's just it. So I had to learn how to breathe, and I had to take time for my breathing practice by cutting out and purging unnecessary things for conscious breathing, as opposed to just throwing that on the pile too, and you talked about something that if you're open to, I'll just expand on when you talk about the breath and why there's different breaths. And when I kind of mentioned like that, I think of anxiety as a physical condition too. For me, first of all, it was empowering because it's true. It is very physical, but also there's such a stigma about the mental that it brought me a lot of comfort to understand what was physically happening in my body that was triggering my anxiety. So I'll just speak to that a little bit as you did. When I'll talk about mine, but this is pretty standard. I think other people might understand this as a firsthand experience. But when my anxiety is at its worst, I get locked into fight or fright or freeze response, like that stress response. And so I would get locked into it. And the more your body is locked into it, then the more it goes off. So you're in this crazy cycle. So when our system is healthy, someone might jump out and yell, boo, and you go, and then your system comes back down, right? And you go about your day. And that's how it's designed to function, right? So the lion is chasing you and you're either dead or you get away and you go on with your day. Your system self-regulates. But my system would get locked in that. And then when you're locked in fight or flight, you can't eat or sleep or concentrate. So for me, that's like the foggy brain, and do simple tasks because your body is so flooded with the adrenaline, right? This adrenaline that, and the shallow breathing that would be handy if you need to run, right? If there's a real physical danger there. Because when it comes to fighting for your life, your body shuts down the focus on any long-term investments, right? So Dr. Sapolsky, the author of Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, he said, your body is not going to worry about digesting breakfast if you're trying to avoid being someone's lunch, right? He said, any maintenance, any long-term maintenance, right? He said, the tornado is coming. You're not going to paint the garage that day, right? So your immune system shuts down, your ability to heal from even like a physical wound, any long-term antibodies that your body produces to keep yourself healthy in the long term, those things shut down. And then it's just a vicious cycle because when we're so run down, then, our system keeps getting triggered. And so that's a piece that when you talked about the health piece, like that's a piece that really needs to get out there because I can make sense of that. Whereas anxiety just doesn't, it's so confusing, right?
The part that is, I think, we're in an era of a time and place and time in history when we're beginning to understand ourselves more holistically. In that, it's interesting. I just had a conversation with Omar Baza. The one thing that he just said that was really simply put was mental health is a thing. There are still a lot of people, and I come across this all the time. A lot of people who don't believe that mental health is an actual thing, But not only is it a thing, it's also very tied to who we are as human beings, like the animals that we are as human beings, And so this idea of, when we talk about anxiety or we talk about our mental health challenges as a problem, or we think we put ourselves down for these challenges that we have, I think another way of looking at it is it's actually the remarkable ways in which who we are as human beings are adaptable. Because often where anxiety comes from is as a result of having an experience of something very stressful or a series of things that have been stressful that we've had to deal with or to process. And what the central nervous system basically is, and actually who we are, like, we talk about artificial intelligence, the intelligence the biological intelligence that we have as human beings is that we're constantly biologically learning. We may not know what we're learning subconsciously, but in some ways, how we can look at anxiety is that we're experiencing anxiety, or why we experience anxiety is because there have been all the subconscious learning that the central nervous system has been doing over time that is now alerting us all the time to, hey, like there's been so much danger that you've experienced up to this point that I'm just going to be on high alert all the time. And while that might not necessarily be efficient, the most efficient way for us, or like even an ideal way for us to want to be, how remarkable is that though? That we have like the system that it's available to all of us, generally speaking, that is looking after us in this way.
It is. It's funny that you say that, because in many ways, I mean, the fact that it got so bad for me, like my system was just on fire, just made it non-negotiable for me to make changes, right? So had it been like a low level hum, right? We really can tolerate a lot, right? And I don't know, if my system hadn't been, putting on the alarm system, I think I might have just kind of coasted a long time with circumstances and default settings that were not meant for the way that I am wired as a human being.
And most of us do act on pain.
Right.
It's a huge motivator. And when we are able to tolerate it, we'll just tolerate it. But it's when it becomes a level of pain, I think, that just says, okay, like you got to do something about it. That's when. And so in some ways, like it's all about perspective, I think is what we've been talking about, what you've been saying. And it is like this double-edged sword. Like on one hand, the pain is so hard, so incredibly difficult to go through. But then there's the other side of it, which is, well, without it, I wouldn't have understood this about myself.
Right. A turning point for me was when I was like, should I keep teaching? Right. I don't think I can do it anymore. And a friend, a very well-meaning friend, looked me in the eye and said, like I was telling her that I was going to leave. I was pretty much at that point. And she looked me in the eye and she said, but Nina, you only have 12 more years, and until I can retire or whatever. Right. And that was so awesome, because it was like, this isn't courage. I don't have a choice. I'm going like this for 12 more years is not an option. Right. So, yeah.
But actually, let's just step back for a moment. I know that you have shared previously that when you identified having experiences of anxiety would be going back around the time that your daughter was born.
Yeah. So for me, I'm like, anxiety happens when it's the perfect storm, like when all the circumstances align, right? So for me, I'd had, in early adulthood and adolescence, and even as a child, looking back now, I see that I'd had anxiety in the past, but it would always go away. So I would have it, and then it would be a non-issue for years. And then it would come back and it would go away. But for me, the tipping point was that my pregnancy and my recovery from birth and caring for my newborn and learning how to breastfeed was all under the cloud of chronic conflict. And so I suffered with severe chronic anxiety at the time. But others have gone through, more dramatic things than that, and anxiety doesn't touch them, right? So I know also, I consider my cultural circumstance to be relevant, like just for example, the normalization of the SAD diet, the standard American diet, the sensory overload, information overload, that all impacts me. I was in a car accident when I was 16, and I had, what resulted then was, kind of 24-hour memory loss, and some stitches on my forehead. But I've spoken to, specialists that are sure that had a part in it. I had trouble feeding when I was a baby initially, and they didn't know that I wasn't eating enough. And when that's, you have major brain development post-birth, so the perfect storm, right? And now that I look back to with hindsight, it was like, we evolve. And I think I wasn't expecting to change careers or feel differently or enter different chapters. Circumstances change and things don't work anymore, right? Circumstances don't work for us anymore. But it's funny because I get less and less interested in the why over time. Like when I was in crisis, it was really important. Like I needed to find some logic in this feeling, right? Because I didn't know how to get rid of it. I didn't know how to solve it. Accessing resources is very difficult. And so the why was important. Like I needed to know, like, it wasn't just about not being able to cope. But now as I'm kind of on the other side of it and just managing it and very open about it, the why kind of becomes less and less important. As a kid, like we were talking, I think it was before you started recording, we were talking about personality and anxiety. And like as a kid and all through my life, I've had a very strong sense of justice. And I think I'm very empathetic and intuitive. And this, even as a kid, would really overwhelm me. Like I remember as a kid, even like hyperventilating because I was so angry, or having massive tantrums or things like that. But I think I always feel like I need to qualify that, because I think if there's one takeaway that I want people to take away about anxiety, is that anxiety itself is not a personality trait. Like, don't define me by my disorder, right? When I'm healthy and I'm not in it, I don't sweat the small stuff, and you and I were talking about, what was it? I think I was talking about starting this work, and I was like, yeah, I'm terrified, but I'm not anxious, right? Like, so I think that's important.
I think the question that I asked you specifically about that is that you have this wealth of experience as a teacher, and having the experiences in relationship with anxiety that you've had, which had that intense situation that happened for you postpartum, it sounds like, that has led you to this path of wanting to educate, support others in their experiences in relationship with anxiety. And the curiosity that I had around that was, for folks who, this is different for everybody, clearly, and this is part of what we're talking about, is that for folks who identify as having and experiencing anxiety, doing something risky or doing something that's outside of the comfort zone could be very anxiety inducing for some folks. And so for you to embark on this very different path from like an entrepreneurship kind of path, which is different from your teaching career. And I wondered how that was for you, or whether anxiety was an experience that was part of that for you.
Yeah. And it's so interesting because it isn't, right? Because like I'm scared but I got the fire back in my belly, right? I feel capable. And when I don't know things, I understand that, of course, I don't know things. I've never done this before, right? I have no background in this. And so I can get my head around that, right? It's much more anxiety inducing to be, anxiety about the anxiety, to be anxious about teaching grade 2 fractions, which I'd done for years, because I don't have the cognitive ability right now to actually do the grade 2 math, right? And to do something that I had done for so long and felt like I was good at and had an impact, to not have that feeling of efficiency or ability anymore is, for me, the anxiety inducing part, right?
Yeah. So maybe part of your experience of anxiety is when maybe you feel butted up against like the sense of, well, this is something that I know and should know. And this is something that I identify within myself that I can't access.
Yeah. I mean, for years, being a teacher was a big part of my identity. And when I was healthy, those were some of the best years of my life so far, like professionally and personally. Like that's my element, right? And to that becomes something that I dreaded was terrifying and anxiety inducing, the bad kind of terrifying, right? Because I don't know what to do about it. And so it's only going to get worse and worse and worse and worse, right? Whereas my personality is to, go take new paths and do things that intrinsically feel good.
I think also what I'm hearing about you and what I'm kind of putting together, but I don't know that this is just from what I'm hearing and what you've shared with me so far, is my sense that you do have the ability within yourself to know the difference between fear and even you saying the difference between good terrifying and bad terrifying and excitement, because many people would lump all of those feelings together as anxiety. There are many people who are not able to pick out or just to have that clarity around, oh no, this feeling, even though it might feel similar to anxiety, is actually fear in this kind of a way, fear in a good kind of a way, or fear in a really terrible kind of a way, or even excitement. For some people, excitement and anxiety can feel very, very similarly, and that can get confusing for people. But what I'm hearing is that you can actually tell the difference within yourself, those different feelings that you have. Yeah.
I think that commonality of not being able to tell the difference kind of speaks to us collectively and where we are in terms of really understanding the day-to-day realities of those of us who struggle, because there's not a lot of support, just even as a whole, for that dialogue, right?
Well, I think that's the reason why the work that you do as supporting and educating folks and maybe coaching folks in understanding and then managing and figuring out and planning for anxiety is so important, because that's the ways in which you have a few steps ahead of maybe someone who's just overwhelmed by maybe feeling their anxiety and not knowing, like, or just feeling maybe just boxed into
yeah.
the experience of it. Yeah.
Yes. That's what's called me to this, to help individuals kind of like untangle it and separate themselves from the anxiety, right? They are not anxious. They are struggling with anxiety, right? It sounds like just semantics, but like,
oh, it's huge.
It's not, yeah. Like I am not an anxious person. I face an anxiety disorder, right? But don't label me a worrier or, I have my head up my butt because I'm just so worried about my own problems, or, all those assumptions, those implications that I felt were being said, and that we're also like very uncomfortable with in anything. Collectively, I find like we're very uncomfortable with like chronic conditions, right? So everyone's allowed to be anxious every once in a while, but there's a lot of like, still, like you had a couple of days off, right? What's the problem, right? That kind of. So of course, then when we're confused about the different terrifying, there's not the venue to untangle that.
Or even like this idea that's an interesting example that you just gave of, is that something that you're still dealing with, right? And what I mentioned a little while ago about mental health is a thing, and more people are recognizing that. But, it's collectively, we have an understanding that if we have the flu, that's like a week, like it takes a week to recover from the flu.
Yeah.
That's something that we understand.
Yeah.
But somehow though, if it's some kind of a mood issue, something that's happened, like it can even be grief sometimes too, like this idea that it's like, oh, like it's been a couple of days. Like, why haven't you, gotten over that already or whatever it is? It's so fascinating to me how there is still this huge gap between, I guess, people's ideas about how we get over things when it comes to mental health challenges versus, like if we break a bone, like, do you expect that you're going to be like, if you break your foot,
totally.
I
remember,
are you going to expect to run? Yeah.
Yeah. Just being on a sick leave was just agony, right? Because, I might pop in to pick something up. And I remember there were colleagues like so well-intentioned, right? But the narrative was, take your time, cozy up in your pajamas. There was some mention of sipping red wine, and we'll see you next week, And I'm thinking, oh God, you have no idea. Right. And and just the silence and that there's no, like, no one sends you flowers or makes casseroles for you. Right. So I remember I was at a school and I was really struggling with my health, chronic acute anxiety, doing everything right, but still struggling. And the school was at the top floor. So there was 4 flights of stairs and for me, it wasn't about throwing myself down those stairs, though I can entirely empathize with the self-harm that often comes with anxiety. And we can certainly speak to that another time. But for me, the fantasy was, tripping on a backpack or something that was left on the stairs or falling. So, everybody would know it was an accident. And Nina fell down the stairs and she broke a few ribs, right? She probably has some cuts and bruises. And then it was like, then I can just get out of here and recover and not have the anxiety about the anxiety, because there'd be no talk about, Nina can't hack it at this school. Nina's not well. Nina's the teacher that had the nervous breakdown. All those things that healthy now, those narratives don't bother me. But when you're coping with your initial anxiety, those can just take it to a whole other level. So I remember just fantasizing about like, can an ambulance just come? Right.
But it's so interesting too, like this idea that for many of us for all of us at some point or another, do experience some kind of a mental health challenge. And for some of us, it's something that we are more aware of more often in our lives than maybe others. But that to think about having some kind of a physical injury that would validate, right, the need to recover, validate the need to not have other people judge or to make things that much more difficult, because like you were saying, the anxiety about anxiety, that as if it isn't bad enough.
Right.
That's the thing that you're experiencing and challenging. But then to feel anxious about the fact that people may not understand or be supportive or judging.
Totally.
And what that could potentially mean.
Yeah.
In a larger sense. Yeah.
And that's why there's still so much work to do. And that for me right now is kind of the missing narrative and that would have really served me well, and that I want to bring that anxiety about the anxiety, because anxiety is confusing and it's frustrating and it's isolating, and that in itself causes this secondary layer of anxiety. The treatment for a broken ankle is very straightforward, right? You go to the hospital, you get a cast, you stay off it, you limp, you go slow. But imagine that it wasn't, right? So imagine like we didn't know what to do for broken ankles. And so we had these people trying to walk it off, right? And hobbling around on this ankle. And I mean, we know the further damage and the further suffering that would cause. And so it's that secondary level of suffering. So that's the anxiety about the anxiety, right?
And I really like that is part of the message that you have. It's one of the first things that I noticed about when I came across initially the flyer for the workshops that you provide. It was right there, and it was something that really resonated for me. And even on your website, in your email. It's all a part of the messaging that you have. The fact that anxiety there is the anxiety about the anxiety, but just within that messaging, just the acknowledgement that it's multifaceted, it's multidimensional.
Yeah. And so, I think that's where my work is, just kind of supporting with the second layer of how can we align your supports and your schedule and to alleviate that secondary layer so that you can focus on healing from that primary layer, which, would include working with you as a psychotherapist, right?
Yeah. And then that could definitely is part of the work too. And it's something that, I've certainly reflected back, like this idea of even self-judgment. It might not even be something that might be coming externally, even though with mental health it often does, but it can also be an internal.
Yes.
It's something that's coming from oneself, like this judgment of like based on background, based on family narratives, based on cultural narratives, like whatever it might be, that I'm not weak. That kind of stuff, right? Like if this is a problem, if I identify this as an actual problem that I have, that equals the fact that I must be weak.
Right.
And I can't have that. Therefore, I'm going to fight it. Therefore, I'm going to judge myself. Therefore, and I often say, it's like, boy, there's so much that you're already dealing with. Why pile that on top of everything else?
We're so good at that.
Yeah. It's so not necessary. And it certainly isn't helpful. Like, I don't know that it's actually going to help things or, to even expedite things, even to get you there a little bit quicker. So it is such an important piece. There's so many pieces. And so I think often, and why I think this kind of conversation that you and I are having is so important is because we sometimes think, I think we might have talked about this last time too, but this idea that things are binary.
Yeah.
You either have a problem, you don't have a problem. This is anxiety or not anxiety, depression or not depression. Whereas it's so layered. There are so many different pieces. And it is a big, giant puzzle, which can be changing at any given time.
Yeah. And with that, like, there's a relief that comes with that understanding, right? There's a relief in like, I don't have all the answers. I know that my anxiety will come back. It does come back. But I know now that I'll figure it out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm curious to know, and one of the, again, like the striking things about coming across your flyer and going to your website and so forth is that you have these circles.
Oh, the circles,
yeah, and the colorful circles. Can you talk more about that?
Sure. Under my name, there's 6 circles, and it's so funny to be talking about the circles. Okay. They come from a time, they make me smile now because I find them very aesthetically pleasing and they kind of mark for me how far I've come. But they come from a time of complete surrender and kind of like a final coping mechanism when I would be at my worst. So there were times when I could just catch myself, and in order to stop the pacing and the rocking and the panic, I would just start drawing circles, and I would draw them. I'm very good at it. I can do like perfect circles, and I would do it on often straight lines on lined paper. And it was just like, you know what? That's all I can do. And it would sometimes become quite meditative because it was, around, up, down, around. Lift the pencil, next one. Around, up, down, around. And so I wish I could romanticize that to, this beautiful moment of serenity when in fact it was just kind of the last straw. I've done it in waiting rooms. I've done it on my couch, waiting for a support person to arrive when it was all I could do, And then sometimes color is really important to me. And sometimes I would start coloring them. And there was a satisfaction that would come in it because, when you can't get anything done or complete a thought or, achieve anything, I would have pages of, perfectly aligned circles. And so I didn't appreciate the time, the metaphor of the circle, and, here we go around and around, and, I will come out of this and I'll be back in it, and I'll come out of it again a little stronger, a little wiser, but that's where they come from originally.
And there's something about knowing that they're there for you. And there's also maybe even in those moments where it doesn't feel like you know where the end is going to be or what that might look like, that symbolically the circle, there's a completeness about it. And even if you're not maybe experientially there, that you have these visual symbols of things, like knowing that you can complete something.
Yeah, I like that. And yeah, they've also like just come to make me think of a time in my life. And it was a pivotal time, right? And great things have come from them. And yeah, I like the circles.
Yeah. And they're almost like markers too, that they were there at different times in your life and they're still here for you now.
And somebody said too, it's like the ellipsis, right? Like ... what's coming next, right? ... Yeah.
I'm just aware of our time because I really, it's so great being able to speak to you, and I just love like the ability for us to, at least in the way that I experience it, just unpacking and kind of flowing with the things that we've been talking about and sharing and adding. A couple of things, if it's okay, I'd like to ask you just a little bit more about anxiety. And I think that there's, many people. Okay, first of all, I actually wanted to take a step back and say that I wanted to thank you for sharing about your experiences of the intensifying of your anxiety of having after your pregnancy, and because being able to talk about, postpartum depression, is talked about, and that's more a part of the narrative. But even then, there's a lot that people still might not recognize or say it's not a thing. That thing that seems to come up quite a bit. But I think that it's really important for us to talk about anxiety in relation to childbirth and motherhood and so forth too, because it was interesting because you mentioned it and then said, there are people who, may experience much worse. But I don't know that it's about comparisons, right? It really is about the fact that, well, in that particular way, what you were saying is that there are people who may experience worse, but not necessarily have anxiety touch them, I think is the context that you were using.
Yeah. And I think the qualifier I put in there too is like, maybe you didn't have trauma or you don't have PTSD, and your anxiety is entirely legitimate. I think that's why I felt like I had to put that in there, because it's like, here's my war story. So I've earned some anxiety. And that's not always the case. And it doesn't make your suffering or your reality of anxiety any less intense.
And that it's not really about a comparison at all. And I think that sometimes it's sort of like this, again, like I talk about double-edged swords a lot, in some ways, because sometimes what we can do is knowing about other people's experiences can allow us to feel as though we're all a part of being human. And rather than for us to go, well, I shouldn't feel that way because someone else has experienced quote unquote worse. It's maybe for us to think about it as we all in our human experiences at some point inevitably have these experiences of difficulty, of stress, of pain, and that we all may internalize them or experience them or feel differently about them, but they're all still our reality. And I did there's a really big circle that I just drew, but I wanted to thank you though for sharing those details, because I think it's important for people to know if someone listening to this and have maybe experienced it and not have acknowledged it within themselves as something that may have caused them pain. And another is also that maybe, folks not having the opportunity to even, again, like to acknowledge that it's a thing. And I think that is so important for us to talk about our experiences so that people are able to go, oh, that was me, or that feels really similar to my thing.
And thank you for coming back to the mother piece too, and the postpartum anxiety, because I could not get anyone to acknowledge my postpartum anxiety, because it was, and I mean, I had midwives. I was in a progressive situation. I have a sisterhood, I have good support people, but there was this, of course it's hard being a new mother. It's natural, right? Or you're coping with conflict. Exactly. Or you have to go to work. And I was trying to explain that, no, I'm actually on fire. Like, this mother thing is, for me personally, it wasn't about, like, that wasn't what was causing my anxiety. And the other thing is, like, I felt like to those that I divulged, it wasn't understood. And to everyone else, I had to hide it because, God forbid, I'm an unfit mother, right? So there's a lot, like, we have a lot to do there.
It's unbelievable, that even like if you were to really, so this is my little rant.
Do it, girl.
It's unbelievable to me, that when you think about, so first of all, I think as a culture, we just like to romanticize everything, right? So to romanticize pregnancy and motherhood and the miracle of, bearing life and all, which is all true, yes. But it's romanticized, yes. Right? But let's just like really think about like what's happening, right? For a woman to be able to grow another human being in her body, what has to happen in order to do that, right? It's that there are all kinds of things that the body has to do in order to sustain another life. And then, so to put that aside for a moment, that there's going to be a lot of hormones and a lot of chemicals and a lot of changes that have to happen in order for that to happen. And once a woman gives birth or is no longer in a state where she is having to sustain a life within her body, the body then has to come back. And so this is like what's happening biologically. And I think about, for myself, I'm not a mother myself, but I think about all the things that the body then has to rebalance and readjust to. And for people to think that just as soon as a baby is born, or again, like the woman's body is no longer having to sustain a life within herself, that as soon as that changes, that she'll be completely, it's like, oh, like back, yes. Fine, everything is good, yes. Right? As opposed to, the body has to come back to a different state of being, or not even back to like another or new state of being. And then like the fact that there's a transition here of the fact that this woman before getting pregnant was not having to think about now taking care of a child that's now outside of her, that her life is completely changed as a result of this experience and transitioning into this new life, the expectations and all these kinds of things that are going on, that does happen. And then to have to figure out what this life is going to be and all kinds of stuff. And then to just expect that she's just going to be like this happy, completely contented, just fully understanding what to do as a mother and, in some cases a partner and another kind of a mother to maybe other children there are so many different pieces, so many different layers. And yet there's this expectation that she'd just be fine. That to me is mind blowing.
Yeah. Her uterus shrinks back. So her belly goes down and then that's it.
Then why wouldn't she be happy? And why wouldn't she just be like, so just overjoyed? And that is going to be her life. That is how she is going to be from now on.
Right.
To me, like, how does that make any sense?
Yeah. And I just see that as like, and that's if everything goes right? Like that's like we haven't even touched on her circumstances or her resources or her supports or, if there's enough food in the house. Like, that's just if everything else is okay.
Yeah. In the most ideal of circumstances, it's still incredibly multifaceted and complicated and complex. And the point, though, being for things to be so complex and yet for this weird expectation that people have. And a lot of people even go through it and still have this expectation of other people.
Yeah. And so, the goal is that one day it's like postpartum anxiety is like having a twisted ankle, right?
Or that everything that we experience is seen as, yes, this is a valid experience. And that it's not meant to just be, oh, you haven't figured that out yet. Or, oh, like you're not done with that thing yet. That the hope is that we get to an understanding at some point of, right, this is going to take time. This is going to take some kindness and some empathy and understanding and some space and tenderness and support. I feel like maybe I've taken us off into a different path, and I hope
good stuff.
that's okay.
Good stuff. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. It's one question that I wanted to ask you as we cap off this part of things.
Sure.
I just feel as though you're very purpose driven, and there's that fire. I think that you've even talked about it as like the fire in your belly and the passion. Do you have a sense of what your goal is in the work that you're doing in relation to anxiety, working with folks who experience it and educating and supporting them? Do you have a goal? Do you have a larger goal, do you think, in mind?
These, I would love to, if I'm able to work with one person and see them through their anxiety in a way that wasn't available to me, then that person will, it will be on their radar, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they will start to be able to support in that way. So it's kind of like I hope for a mushrooming effect, because I really feel like good intentions are there. No one was trying to abandon me or not meet my needs, or, that was never my belief. Like, there's a lot of people trying to support others who just don't know how to do it. And there's a lot of people who are suffering that just don't have the tools to work through it, right? So, the good intentions are there. And so I guess I just want to bank on those, and then those will just pay themselves forward. And I've said this in your last episode, like, this keeps me healthy. Like, I love this. This is part of anxiety management for me, right? Mm. This is keeping that anxiety about the anxiety away.
Mm-hmm. Connection is so important.
Mm.
And just to, again, like, I think to feel as though we're a part of rather than a part.
Yeah.
I think is so crucial. And I feel very similarly, at least in the way that I, just heard you talking about it, in my own way of thinking about why I do the kind of work that I do. And even, with this podcast, for instance, is the idea of trying to create a ripple effect, that the more pebbles I throw in to the pond or the lake, that the more it will have resonance, the more it'll spread. And sometimes I may not have a clue as to how much of a ripple it might have, or like what kind of an impact that it might have. But the best that I can do, at least, is to hope that it's happening. And in order for me to hope that it's happening means that I have to get out there. And for myself anyway, there is some anxiety in relation to the risks that I take. But to me, though, there are things that are so important, or it's important enough for me, that it's worth the anxiety that comes along with taking those risks. Again, like, thank you for not only sharing your experiences, but also the work that you're doing, and to know that it's something that has ignited a passion for you to do, which is
Yeah.
really great, because that's what resonates, right? Like that's like when people are able to, when we come across folks, and when I've come across you, and I can get a sense of like how much meaning it has for you. It also, connects in that place in me. And that's,
and that's a healing property, isn't it? Like when somebody can say me too, that's why I guess me too is so powerful, right? Like there's a chemistry there, you've walked it.
And as we cap off our conversation today, and this is the 2 questions that I ask everybody that I speak to, that I have the privilege to speak to on this podcast. You had mentioned a resource for the holiday-related anxiety previously in episode 18, and I'll just mention it here again. You put together a resource that people could, if they're looking to get some information about how they themselves can manage holiday-related anxiety or plan for it, that they can email you. And can you give us that email again, Nina?
Oh, well, we're always evolving. So I have a new one.
No, great.
But is that okay?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Or what should I do?
No, so if you can first give me the email address, or give us the email address for that previous resource.
So you can email me at ninakmoore@gmail.com. And I can give you the resource. Was that the one for the holiday support?
So yeah, that was for the holiday support, but I know, and I was going to ask you about if you have one today as well. So if you can share that with us now too, that would be great.
Oh, okay. Well, I do write regularly. I post on my blog regularly just about like my little insights and my little experiences of, the day-to-day reality of anxiety. So sometimes I pop to the past and I think about a time and how I got through it, or something current that happens that triggers a lesson or a tool for me. That's on my website at ninakmoore.com. But I would also love to hear stories and insights from you, little tricks and tips and stories. And please let me know if I can share them, or if you'd like to keep them private. I mean, that's my medicine as well.
And so for any of you listening who would be open to connecting or want to connect with Nina, and to also share your experiences with her as well. And it's so powerful. I also am just recalling a book that you had mentioned while we were speaking, The Zebra.
Oh, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And that's by Robert Sapolsky. I think it's Sapolsky. And it's a book that you don't need to read cover to cover. I certainly didn't, but he talks about the nervous system, and he is the one that helped me to understand the mechanics of what happens when my body freezes. And he speaks a lot about how, we are the only animals that get locked into the stress response because of psychological factors. So, our ancestors and our fellow animals were triggered when a lion is chasing us. And now we are triggered because we are thinking about next month's rent, right? And so he kind of brings, our biology into, kind of the conflict of what it was designed to do with the circumstances that we're living with today.
Everything that you've talked about, but that's available, it sounds like, within that book is, I think, something that's really valuable for people to know, that it just helps to ground, I think, the experience and understanding like what could be happening internally in relation to why.
And just as a little disclaimer, like, when I was in anxiety, I initially put a lot of pressure on myself to understand it. And yet, my brain was not working at full capacity, right? Like the energy goes to your body to fight, right? It's harder to concentrate. So I just hope that there's no pressure put on anyone to understand it while you're in it. But when you kind of come on the other side, or you have some relief, then I find it to be a really empowering experience to read about anxiety.
And that's a really great point, because there are different people that deal with their experiences differently.
Yeah.
And some people really dive into the why. And without it, there could just be like a sense of things being uncontained. But then there are some folks who are like, nope, that's not, what I need in this moment. And so I think that being able to talk about different experiences again and different resources, just to have them available. And like you say, though, there isn't a one way, and there certainly isn't a pressure, because some people may not have any interest in understanding it, and that's fine. But if that is something that people are interested in, there are also resources for that. And as I keep capping things off. So this is,
I know.
But the one thing that I do ask this of you previously, but I asked this of all my guests. If there is a lesson or a good to know kind of a thing, like I said before, like this is the reason why I call this podcast Life Stuff 101, is just because all this stuff is all life stuff. What is something in relation to, it doesn't necessarily even have to be anxiety actually, but if there is something that you wish that you would had access to or had known earlier in life, what do you think that would be?
I used to think, and I still do sometimes, I still get stuck in it, but I used to think that when I was suffering, any kind of psychological suffering, it was that I was getting something wrong, right? And it was that I thought this is not how life should be. So I've come to understand that suffering is part of a full, complete life. And it's about learning from it. And for me, this understanding lifts my anger about my anger, my sadness about my sadness, my shame about my shame, right? And it just lets me focus on that primary condition. So there's less of a spin out now.
It's so great. Thank you again, Nina. Nina K. Moore. Thank you. And thank you for the dedication and commitment and the work that you're doing, and to know that folks don't have to be alone in the experiences.
Back at you, girl. Thank you.
I'm so grateful to have had Nina back on the podcast and to know how dedicated she is to supporting folks who identify with experiencing anxiety. To learn more about Nina and her work, all her links are included in the show notes. And before I end off for today, and if you haven't already, please subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts, and if you'd be so kind, please leave a review. Again, if it could be helpful for you to get some self-care prompts during this difficult time, please head on over to lifestuff101.com/challenge to get started on getting those self-care prompts, which will be released on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays during this time of the COVID-19 crisis. Thank you so much for joining me today. And until next time, please stay safe and in good health wherever you are in the world. And I'll be speaking with you again either on the next full episode of Life Stuff 101 next Tuesday, or in one of the Challenging Times Self-Care Challenge episodes real soon.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Life Stuff 101. If you haven't already, please subscribe so that you'll be among the first to be notified when new episodes are released. Always be sure to check out lifestuff101.com for show notes and to be a member of Mio's Miracle Mob. Because as the wise modern-day philosopher John Bon Jovi once said, miracles happen every day. Change your perception of what a miracle is, and you'll see them all around you.